Alright, so here's a question that's going to ruin your afternoon. You're a surgeon. Your patient's on the table. There is one reference book, one, that maps the nerve that you need to avoid so that this person doesn't lose the use of their hand forever. That book was illustrated using the corpses of people murdered by Nazis. Do you open it? Because this isn't actually a thought experiment. This is a thing that actually happens today in real operating rooms with real surgeons making this exact call. We like to think that the horrors of the past stay in the past, locked behind museum glass, separated from us by time and trials and never again. But medicine has a secret. A few of them, actually. Some of the tools we use, some of the knowledge that saves lives right now, it was paid for by people who never consented, often violently, often fatally, and nobody wrote them a receipt. This is the story of the consent debt and why modern medicine still hasn't paid it off. So, Mengele, you were already thinking about him. Angel of death, twin experiments, the face of Nazi medicine. Here's the thing no one tells you. His experiments were just junk. Not evil genius junk, just junk. They were ideologically driven, poorly controlled, and designed to confirm racial theories rather than discover anything real or useful. There is no Mengele data sitting in a vault somewhere tempting scientists. There's nothing to tempt them with. Which should be reassuring, except for it really is not. Because the stuff that did end up in textbooks and military manuals and medical breakthroughs, that comes from places most people have never even heard of. And unlike Mengele's garbage, this knowledge worked. Which makes it so much worse. So let's start with a book. In the 1930s, an Austrian anatomist named Edward Pernkopf began work on what would become one of the most detailed anatomy atlases ever created, the Topographische Anatomie des Menschen. 7 volumes, 20 years of work, painted using a 4-color printing technique that had never been done before. The illustrations are, and I hate that this is true, breathtaking. The level of detail on nerve pathways, tissue layers, vascular structures. Surgeons who have used it says nothing else comes close, especially for peripheral nerve surgery. If you need to know exactly where a nerve sits in relation to surrounding tissue, this atlas is, according to multiple published surgical papers, peerless. But here's the cost of that detail. Pernkopf was a committed Nazi. He gave an inaugural lecture as Dean of University in Vienna Medical School in full Nazi uniform, swastikas on his arm and everything, while the faculty gave the Hitler salute. His illustrators, Erich Leppier, Franz Bartke, Karl Endresser, were also Nazis. They signed their paintings with swastikas and SS lightning bolts. Later editions airbrushed these out, but you can still see the traces if you know where to look. And the bodies that they painted? At least 1,377 corpses of executed prisoners were delivered to the University of Vienna's anatomy department between 1938 and 1945. So it's political prisoners, Roma, Jews, LGBT people. Researchers estimate that roughly a quarter of all bodies supplied to the department were execution victims. So here's where that consent debt comes due. It's not the 1940s anymore. We have MRI, we have CT scans, we have digital modeling. For most surgical planning, you don't need Pernkopf's Atlas. But for certain peripheral nerve procedures, the kind where millimeters matters and a wrong move means permanent damage, some surgeons say it's still the single best visual reference that exists. Not tied for first by a big margin. A surgeon facing a complex nerve repair, where Pernkopf's Atlas provided anatomical detail no other resource could match. The publisher Elsevier pulled the Atlas out of print. You can still buy it on eBay for a few $100. A team at UCLA is building a replacement, a new Atlas project called Mariyad that could eventually make Pernkopf obsolete. But eventually isn't the word you want to hear when your patient is already under anesthesia. That's the first layer of the consent debt. Knowledge taken from the dead that the living still need. And hold on to that because it's about to get way worse. In 1941, the German Luftwaffe had a problem. Their pilots were dying, not in combat, but from exposure. Ditched in the North Sea or the English Channel, they succumbed to hypothermia before rescue could arrive. So the Nazi regime authorized experiments at Dachau concentration camp. Between 300 and 400 prisoners, mostly Polish and Russian, were submerged in tanks of ice water or forced to stand naked in freezing conditions for hours. Around 80 of them died. The goal was straightforward. Find out exactly how the human body shuts down in extreme cold. How long until consciousness fails? What rewarming methods work and which ones kill faster? And unlike Mengeler's pseudoscience, the Dachau hypothermia data was detailed. Temperature curves, time to death measurements, rewarming protocols. It looked like real science. It felt like real science. And for decades, it was treated like real science. After the war, at least 45 published scientific papers cited the Dachau experiments. The data was quietly used by military organizations across multiple countries, including the United States, to develop cold weather survival protocols. It showed up in training manuals and safety guidelines. Then, in 1990, a researcher named Robert Berger went through the Dachau data line by line and published his findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. His verdict? The experiments were a mess. Inconsistent, measurements were unpredictable, conditions were unreliable, and he called it scientific fraud. The journal editor responded by banning any paper that cited Nazi experiments. Full stop. A hypothermia researcher named Robert Pozos pushed back hard. He argued that refusing to use the data was itself unethical if it meant people died from cold exposure when you had the information that could have saved them. Then Pozos spent the next 2 years thinking about it and changed his mind. And that's the second layer. It's not just knowledge from the dead, it's knowledge extracted through torture. And even the people who wanted to use it couldn't live with the decision. So far we've talked about data that exists and people arguing over whether to use it. This next one's different. This is the case where a government looked at the data, looked at the war crimes and said, yeah, we'll take it, what do we owe you? Between 1936 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a biological warfare research facility in Harbin, Manchuria. It was called Unit 731. It was run by General Shiro Ishii, and it was one of the most horrific operations of the Second World War. 3,000 personnel, 150 buildings, capacity to hold 600 prisoners at a time. And the experiments I'm gonna keep brief because the details are genuinely difficult to describe. They included live vivisections, deliberately infecting people with the plague and cholera, frostbite, exposure, and weapons testing on human subjects. Now, after the war, when the Allies discovered what had happened, well, you'd expect something like Nuremberg, right? Trials, justice, accountability, all of that. That's what happened in Europe with Nazi doctors. In Japan, something different happened. General Douglas MacArthur struck a deal. The United States granted full immunity to Ishii and his entire team, no prosecution, no trial, no public accountability. In exchange, every document, every data set, every in-person briefing on Japan's biological weapons program, all of it funneled exclusively to the American military to be incorporated into the US biological weapons research program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Declassified documents from 2005 revealed it went even further. The US didn't just grant immunity, they made direct cash payments to former Unit 731 personnel for their data. Ishii was never tried. He died of throat cancer in 1959 at home in bed. Other Unit 731 members went on to run pharmaceutical companies, hold government positions, lead university departments. Japan didn't officially acknowledge Unit 731 even existed until the 1980s. And the data? Folded into American military research. No attribution, no acknowledgement, not a single victim's name attached to any of it. That's the third layer. Not just knowledge from the dead, not just knowledge from torture, knowledge your government actively bought, then buried the receipt. That's not a debt, that's a heist. Well, if you've made it this far, you might well be telling yourself a comforting story. That this is a wartime thing. That this took dictatorships and invasions and the total collapse of civilization for the consent debt to accumulate. So let's begin with Baltimore 1951. No war, no regime, just a hospital. Henrietta Lacks was a 31-year-old African-American woman being treated for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins. During a biopsy, a doctor named George Gay took a sample of her tumour cells, without her knowledge, without her consent, and sent them to his lab. Her cells refused to die. Every other human cell line researchers had tried to culture would eventually stop dividing. Hers didn't. They doubled every 24 hours. They were effectively immortal. They became known as HeLa cells, and they became the foundation of modern biomedical research. The polio vaccine, developed using HeLa cells. The HPV vaccine, HeLa. Chemotherapy protocols, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization research, HIV studies, COVID-19 vaccine development, all of it built on the foundation of cells taken from one woman who never said yes. Over 100,000 scientific papers have been published using HeLa cells. They contributed to work that earned 3 Nobel Prizes. Biotech companies have sold and profited from HeLa cells for decades. And the Lacks family? They found out about HeLa in mid-1970s, 2 decades later, when researchers started contacting them for blood samples. For most of their lives, Henrietta's children couldn't afford health insurance. In 2023, the family reached a settlement with Thermo Fisher Scientific, one of the companies that had been selling HeLa cells commercially. The terms were undisclosed. Now, the consent issue here is different from the wartime cases. No one murdered Henrietta Lacks for her cells. The practice of taking tissue samples without patient consent was standard in 1951, apparently. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't at all unusual. Doctors did it all the time. And that's what makes this case cut deeper than the others. The wartime stories, you can point at a monster, Pernkopf in his uniform, Ishii in his lab. But Henrietta Lacks was failed by normal people following normal procedures. The debt piled up through indifference, through routine, through the quiet assumption that science matters more than the person on the table. Henrietta Lacks' story helped change that. The backlash eventually contributed to the Federal Common Rule in 1991, which established informed consent as a legal requirement in federally funded research. Her case is taught in every medical ethics course in the country. But the cells are still out there, still dividing, still being sold. As of right now, you can order HeLa cells online for about $100 a vial. That's the 4th layer. You don't need a war, you don't need a dictator, you just need a system that treats people as raw material. And nobody asking permission. Now, you'd think at some point somebody would have built a system to stop this, and someone did, but it took one more disaster to make it happen. The Tuskegee syphilis study, 1932 to 72. 40 years. The US Public Health Service tracked untreated syphilis in roughly 400 black men in Alabama. They told them they were getting treatment for bad blood. They weren't getting treatment at all. Even after penicillin came out, the standard cure in the 1940s, well, treatment was deliberately withheld so that researchers could watch what happened. 28 men died directly. 40 of their wives were infected. 19 children born with congenital syphilis. Tuskegee didn't produce useful data. It wasn't even trying. But when it was exposed in 72, it did something none of the other cases on this list managed. It made people angry enough to build guardrails. The National Research Act, the Belmont Report, the Institutional Review Boards, the entire modern framework of research ethics, every consent form you've ever signed before a clinical trial, exists pretty much because of Tuskegee. In 1997, President Clinton stood in the White House and apologized. So that's the safety net. The question you should be asking is it actually catching anything? So let's come back to where we started, the operating room, the Atlas, and the patient. I'm not going to give you a neat answer. I don't have one. Nobody does, and honestly, be suspicious of anyone who claims to. But I don't think the interesting question is the abstract one. Should we destroy the Atlas, or should we ban the data? That's a philosophy seminar. The interesting question is the one you can't dodge. Your patient's on the table. The nerve is right there. The only reference that shows its exact picture was painted from the body of someone who was murdered for being wrong religion or the wrong ethnicity or had the wrong politics. You can save this patient's hand, maybe even their life, with knowledge that was stolen from someone who can never give or withhold consent again. What do you do? I don't know. And I think the fact that we don't know, that we can't know, not fully, not comfortably, is the point. The consent debt doesn't get paid off. That's the whole problem. You can't give consent on behalf of a dead person. You can't unuse data that already saved someone else's life. You can't make Henrietta Lacks' cells immortal again. All you can do is stop pretending the bill was never written.